Hey everyone, it's Glenn Greenwald back with a new episode of System Update exclusively on Rumble, and I'm back in order to discuss some major news regarding the US's last drone strike in Afghanistan on August 29th, which they claimed at the time killed two critical ISIS planners on their way to Kabul airport who were planning to detonate a bomb, and that they didn't think there were any civilian casualties. And the breaking news is something that ought to have been obvious at the time, and yet most media figures simply ignored. The breaking news is that they lied and admit they lied, that in fact they killed no ISIS planners, no ISIS terrorists with that drone strike, but instead extinguished a family of 10 people, including the person they aimed at, who was simply moving water bottles around. And therefore, contrary to their claims, there was no secondary explosions caused by the bombs carried by these terrorists as they originally claimed as well. Here's Pentagon spokesman John Kirby earlier today explaining and admitting that they lied.
I'm not going to relitigate the past statements here. As General McKenzie mentioned, every leader in the department that spoke to this in the moment that it was spoken to was speaking to you in good faith based on the information that we had. And that includes me, by the way. Things that I said, obviously, have not turned out to be correct.
No, he, of course, is saying, look, I didn't lie. We didn't lie. We told you the truth at the time. But as you're going to see, they were incredibly definitive. They were saying they knew for a fact they had killed ISIS terrorists, that they knew for certain that that was true. And yet it turned out it was completely false. Either they were utterly reckless and therefore shouldn't be trusted, or they were deliberately lying and therefore shouldn't be trusted. And what's amazing about this is that there was all the reason in the world to be highly skeptical of their claims from the start, in part because that's what journalists do. We're skeptical of government claims that are presented without evidence, not mindlessly ratifying them, but also because they've told similar lies over and over and over for the last 20 years. They shoot a missile at people they don't even know who they're killing, and then they claim that they're terrorists or militants, and the media goes and simply repeats it as if it's true without an ounce of skepticism. And that's what the media did here as well in the initial aftermath of this drone strike. Watch how they basically acted as White House spokespeople, stenographers, telling the country, you can breathe a sigh of relief, you should be happy. We just took out two ISIS terrorists, even though they had no idea if it was true. Here's, as just one example, NBC Nightly News, the most watched news broadcast in the country, or second most, with millions and millions of people watching. Watch how they conveyed what happened.
After 5 p.m. local time, as the sun was starting to set over Kabul, the U.S. military says it carried out a drone strike against an ISIS-K vehicle heading for the airport. The drone tracked the white car as it drove through this residential neighborhood just west of the airport, and the strike happened around 2 miles from the perimeter. U.S. Central Command says the vehicle was packed with explosives and posed an imminent threat. When it was hit, those bombs went off and caused significant secondary explosions. You can see this happened right next to houses, and there are reports that an Afghan child was killed in the blast. The U.S. military says it's looking into that, but has no indications at this time of civilian casualties. No U.S. personnel were injured, and this doesn't appear to have had any impact on the evacuation effort. President Biden did warn last night that an attack was highly likely. But just because this plot appears to have been thwarted doesn't mean the danger to U.S. troops is over. The White House has said all along that the most dangerous hours of this operation would be the final hours ahead of Tuesday's deadline for withdrawal.
Do you hear that propaganda, that outright propaganda? First of all, he says, oh, there's reports that one Afghan child was killed, but he hastens to add that Pentagon denies that. In fact, 7 Afghan children were killed. 7 children wiped out. Their lives ended in an instant, several of whom were under 2. But the much bigger sin is that they endorsed the narrative that they killed people who were on their way to Kabul with bombs in their cars with malintent to blow people up. And they even say there were huge secondary explosions, which is what caused the civilian casualties, if they happened at all. And worse, he says at the end, look, we got these terrorists this time, but don't think the threat is over. There are still other bad guys out there meaning to do harm. Not an iota of questioning or skepticism that maybe what the government said about all of this isn't true. They're just disseminating the claims as if it's, quote, news, just like their title says, NBC News. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that we should criticize the media for lacking skepticism with 2020 hindsight now that the Pentagon admits they lied. I said it at the time. In fact, I made a video on August 30th right here on Rumble, and you can see that on the screen. The title of it was Afghan Drone Strike. What happened to the media's vaunted Trump-era skepticism about government claims? And the whole point of this video was to criticize the media at that time for simply mindlessly disseminating the Pentagon's claim is about two separate drone strikes, one on August 27th, another on August 29th, both of which they claimed killed ISIS plotters and planners, even though there was no evidence presented. And I walked you through how during the Trump years, they used to be skeptical about everything. Anything Donald Trump asserted or Trump officials asserted, they would say Trump officials say, quote, without evidence or baselessly or even sometimes falsely, which is journalistic skepticism. Unfortunately, they never did it before Trump and they don't do it after. It was a one-time deal only for Donald Trump. And the whole point of this video was to say, when the Pentagon comes out and claims that they killed people and that those people were ISIS terrorists, don't just mindlessly believe it as you're doing, but exercise journalistic skepticism. Tell the public there's no reason to believe it until evidence is presented, until an investigation is undertaken, but instead they did the opposite. Here's what I said on August 30th about how the media was treating those two drone strikes. She does the same thing. She summarizes what the U.S. government says. They carried out a drone strike. They killed ISIS-K planners in Kabul. And she just asserts at the end, quote, no civilian casualties. All throughout the media, you see it over and over. Here's the New York Times report on that drone strike. It simply quotes, uncritically, a commander in Afghanistan who said, quote, the unnamed airstrike occurred in the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan. Initial indications are that we killed the target. We know of no civilian casualties. No, he asserted it without evidence. No, he presented no evidence, just disseminated without a molecule of skepticism. Here's from CNN, exactly the same thing. According to a statement from Central Command, we got the target. We know of no civilian casualties. The same CNN, the same New York Times that 3 years ago, 2 years ago was saying when people would say this under Trump, or Trump himself would say things like this, he claims with no evidence, suddenly that journalistic practice is gone and they just assert whatever they're told as though it's true. Now, there were two drone strikes, one on August 27th, one on August 29th. We know for certain because they now admit it that they made false claims, fundamentally false claims about the August 29th one. But it doesn't even matter. That critique that I voiced right after those drone strikes would have been true even if it didn't turn out that the Pentagon's claims were false. Journalistic skepticism is necessary in all cases when government officials make important claims to the public but don't present evidence for them. If you don't know that, if that's not an instinct of yours, you should just quit journalism and go work for the White House or go work for the Pentagon or go work for the CIA. And yet, as I just showed you, they just mindlessly repeat what the Pentagon says. And in this case, they got caught with their pants down because the August 29th strike, at least, the Pentagon made all kinds of false claims that they got the media to disseminate. We still don't know whether they told the truth about the August 27th. Now, let's look at a couple of examples. I showed you from NBC News how they said, look, we got bad guys this time, but the threat is still here. Here is a tweet from the New York Times national security reporter Charlie Savage that should go in the Hall of Fame for humiliating journalistic gullibility and stenography. Remember, Charlie Savage was the same reporter who in 2020 spread the CIA's lies that the Russians had put bounties on the heads of American soldiers, which the CIA invented to allow pro-war Democrats and Liz Cheney to unite as they did to prevent Trump and his efforts to try and withdraw from Afghanistan. So he's back at it. On August 29th, he quoted an AP story that said the drone strikes vehicle had, quote, multiple suicide bombers on the way to Kabul airport, threat believed eliminated. And above that tweet, Charlie Savage said, announced, celebrated, quote, the U.S. clearly has a remarkable intelligence line of sight into ISIS-K right now. That's the kind of thing you say. That's the way that you react if you're a propagandist for the United States government and the security services, not if you're a journalist. They didn't have any sight at all, let alone a remarkable intelligence line of sight into ISIS-K, because the people they killed had nothing to do with ISIS-K, but you had people like Charlie Savage and NBC News misleading the public into believing that they had killed terrorists, and therefore you shouldn't worry whether there are civilian casualties or not, and it all turned out to be untrue. Now, let me just show you two videos. The first is the same John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, who sheepishly had to go up to the podium today and said, yes, things I told you were untrue. Here, listen to the certainty with which he affirmed on August 30th at a Pentagon briefing that this happened. And you're going to see as well one of the key generals who does the same thing. So here's John Kirby. He's asked explicitly, are you sure we got ISIS terrorists in this threat, in this attack? And listen to how he just lies.
I think when the time is right, we'll be able to try to help better flesh that out. Time's not right for that right now, Tom. Barb.
Two quick questions, if I may. On the strike against the vehicle, the Central Command talked about secondary explosions, I think, in that, but do you actually have visual evidence that there were secondary explosions? Are you convinced that there were? Because that seems to be one of the potential contributing factors to civilian casualties. So are you certain there were secondary explosions?
Yes.
I just have a follow-up on a different part of this. Can you say how you're sure?
No.
My other question.
Look at those sociopaths. He just lies right to your face. He's not even really lying to the reporter who asked. He's lying to you. She didn't say, do you believe? She said, are you certain that there were secondary explosions and that you have visual evidence of it? And he said, yes, we're certain. But of course, we can't tell you what that evidence is. You know why? Because it didn't exist. They also asked him, who are these really important ISIS planners you killed? And he said, oh, we can't tell you that. You know why? Because they didn't kill any. But he stood at the podium and told you that they are certain that they did. Now, here's a very similar sociopathic lying from the Army Major General William Hank Taylor, who works at the Pentagon and is responsible for disseminating communications. Listen to what he said at the same briefing about this drone strike.
On Sunday, U.S. military forces conducted an unmanned over-the-horizon airstrike on a vehicle known to be an imminent ISIS-K threat. This self-defense strike successfully hit the target near Kabul airport. Significant secondary explosions from the targeted vehicle indicated the presence of a substantial amount of explosive material. We are aware of reports of civilian casualties, and we take these reports very seriously, and we are continuing to assess the situation.
None of that happened. None of that happened. They did not kill any ISIS attackers on their way to Kabul airport. There were no secondary explosions. And it was very clear from the beginning that there were a lot of civilians killed because people on the ground were saying so. But of course, they didn't want to even give credence to those stories because they wanted you to react emotionally. Remember, it was a very high time of emotions. All of us were horrified, angry, and disgusted at the suicide attack that killed dozens of Afghans and 13 U.S. service members. And so they knew that those emotions could be easily exploited by getting you to believe that as long as they killed more of those monsters on their way to the airport with bombs in their cars, it's okay if they killed some civilians by accident because the bombs blew up when they launched the drone strike. The whole thing was a fairy tale. It was fiction. And they've done this over and over. Now, in this case, they got caught. Why? Because to their credit, the New York Times did an extremely thorough on-the-ground investigation using surveillance footage and interviews with people on the ground. And on September 10th, 2021, they published this excellent expose that was headlined, "In U.S. Drone Strike, Evidence Suggests No ISIS Bomb." And they went on to analyze that the Pentagon story was almost certainly false from the start to the finish. And that's why they ended up today being forced to admit that they lied. Now, the only reason they got caught is because this happened in Kabul, which at the time was all eyes were on Kabul because of the chaos surrounding the U.S. investigation and the suicide attack at Kabul airport. And so there were tons of media on the ground and they just couldn't get away with lying. But this is how they lie all the time for the last 10 years at least. When they drone people, as I recounted in that video, they just automatically say everyone we killed was a militant or a terrorist. And for 10 years, if not longer, the US media has been mindlessly affirming that it's true. I've been writing about this for years. You can go back to my work at Salon when I was there from 2007 till 2013, at The Guardian in 2013 and 14, and repeatedly at The Intercept, inveighing against this media practice of just accepting whatever the Pentagon says is true with no evidence, notwithstanding how much we know that the CIA and the security services lie. They did it over and over here. The New York Times deserves credit for this investigation, but it was a rarity, an aberration, because of the fact that there was so much attention being paid to Kabul. The problem is that our perceptions are formed in the immediate aftermath by journalists like Charlie Savage, like who you saw on NBC News, like tons of others on CNN and elsewhere, who won't express skepticism about Pentagon or intelligence officials when there's a president that they like. And as a result, our impression of what happened here was completely distorted by a combination of Pentagon propaganda and their media servants who uncritically spread it.